Hi, everyone. Welcome to the In Between podcast, where we imagine a new way forward together. I'm Katie, and this is my husband, Gabe. Say hello, Gabe.
Hello, Katie, and hello, audience.
Well, today we can just jump right into mentioning that we're going to be tackling the question: is church worth it? And was it ever? But before we actually get into the topic, I thought, in the vein of just being honest with each other and setting up the reminder for our audience that although we might do the tiniest bit of prep for this, that the hope is that this is an just authentic, sort of off the cuff conversation. And as part of that conversation, thought it would be good to just check in with how are you doing today, Gabe? And what are you bringing into this conversation?
So I'm doing all right. It's been a busy last couple of weeks, but being able to kind of chill and think about what I'm going to do leading towards the week, and just kind of getting in that planning phase of being able to take a step back from what's been going on and taking a step at where I want to go looking forward, even within the next day or the next week or whatever it might be. But just kind of being able to plan those things has been a nice thing now that I've like kind of been able to reset a little bit and we've been able to reset.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of those feelings concerning like different things that are going on inside of myself, and um, same way like planning how I want to approach those things going forward this next coming week or this next month. So a lot of that kind of like outward thinking. And how about you, Katie?
So you're in planning brain mode.
Yeah, right now, I mean, I don't have a whole lot going on this week so far. So yeah, kind of want to take a step back and think about, okay, how can I like kind of fix things or tweak things and different things like that?
That makes sense. Well, for me, I feel like I've been telling everybody, especially in the last couple of days, that I, at the time of recording, so we are recording towards the end of May to shatter the illusion just a little bit. But there was a part of me that was like stepping into this month. I was somehow deluded into thinking that we were going to have a sort of chill, restful, like flow, it's totally fine kind of month this month, and that has not been the reality at all. we we have had a different event that we've helped with or have gone to or drove to another city or something every weekend, and we still have more stuff for the rest of this month. So honestly, I feel like my brain, I think, is grounded, but my body feels scattered, if that makes sense. Like I feel like I've been having to focus really hard. Like even in this call so far of just recording this episode, I feel like I've had to focus really intentionally on just my breathing and being where my feet are fully, because I feel like I haven't had a full reset yet this month to just like fully transition from it feels like we're doing a lot to preparing to doing whatever is next
Hmm.
and whatever is coming. So with all that being said, like even in this conversation, I am transitioning from thinking about planning for pretty much the biggest event of the year that the nonprofit that I work with like puts on, which I'm very excited for and have prepped for. And at the same time, I still just sort of feel jittery about it. So like part of me is in planning mode for work. Part of me is in like I'm just trying to be present for this conversation, and then the other part of me I think is just feeling the effects of having the design of this podcast be that we're not putting in like hours and hours of prep and like prepared, notes to bring to the table. And I
Hmm.
think part of me is experiencing now I'm feeling a little bit, I don't know, a little bit jittery about starting the conversation, even though I'm actually quite excited and I know that I have a lot of thoughts to share as part of this conversation. But yeah, so I'm coming in today just sort of focusing on my breathing,
Yeah, you're like
honestly.
kind of coming down the hill and kind of arriving at where we're at now, at least being able to kind of take things as they come.
Yes. So all of this intro is me tumbling down the hill into I'll be fine.
Yeah.
Oh. So that's how I am.
Hmm. That makes sense.
Well,
Cool.
that being said, do you want to jump into the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk about the first thing we're going to go over is kind of like what the church is to us, like kind of thinking about what our identity was is within it, what our roles are, how we view it, what it like kind of is, or what we think it is, or what it should be. These kind of like different
Mm-hmm.
things that we come to the table with, like even not only for us, but also kind of everybody else comes to this table of thinking about where to go, where to be within church.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're actually touching on something that I do think about a lot. In fact, I ranted about it to my mom a couple weeks ago. That just nailing down or coming to some agreed upon definition of just what is church, much less what is the church. So I know that you did look into a little bit of scripture like beforehand. Where are you landing? How would you engage with the question of, first of all, just what is the church?
You're trying to make them think that I'm the prepared one now.
Well, I mean, you do have scriptures pulled up. I have
Yeah.
nothing.
So I just watched a couple of
It's
things
all here.
beforehand, kind of getting an idea of how other people have approached that, like within their videos, where it's like, oh, this is an introduction to whatever curriculum, or here's an introduction to this idea in a video, and those different kind of things. I just kind of like I said, kind of like taking a step back and thinking about, okay, like what are the different like assumptions that I've made with this, or how my view has kind of changed a little bit over time, and how I view the church.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think that's a really cool part of it is like we all come from different places and we all um, have different things that we want to be or want to do and everything. Like there is no one size fits all for church. Really, there's like
Mhm.
a proven
Mhm.
method in how people start churches or how they run like a service or anything like that, but there is no proven way to say, okay, this church, like, if you have these things, this will fit everybody, and like everybody will want to come to church. Everybody will be welcome to your church, and everybody will feel like this is the place because it's not supposed to be. Not everybody is supposed to go to the same church or be at the same place, but
Ooh.
there are so many different sects and everything, and sometimes we get lost in all the different details. But the reality is that some people need a different place to be, and that the church, like as a community of believers, like there's like, kind of like an international church and everything, or like worldwide church,
Right.
but on a local level, like every place is so different, and that comes out of a desire for people to feel comfortable and to want to be able to serve people the best they can. But the reality is that they can't have the knowledge of all these millions and billions of people say, oh, this is what everybody wants. But a lot of times they come to it with, this is what I really wanted or what I found was really useful. And so I'll start it out of the concept of that. But where it goes from there is like it's anybody's game in a way.
Mhm. I love your like touching on the idea of what I'm hearing essentially of contextualization,
Mhm.
which I do think is so good and so important when it comes to not just the conversation of what is church or what is the church, but also just what is the Christian faith. So, like, this is one little rabbit trail, and I'll pull it back. I promise. But the one little rabbit trail that I'm thinking of is the idea that our faith is a faith that in a lot of ways is essentially designed to be contextual, to be contextualized. It should look different in different cultures. It should look different. I mean, even to the point of like Austin, for example, has a lot of very clear geographical divides that kind of come along with different cultural backgrounds and identities of those different parts of the city that even just in a city in one place, locally speaking, that there should be some difference in the expression of the local church and some difference in beauty in the expression of worship in our faith. So I love that, and I wanted to call it out.
Yeah.
And I want to add on that, going back to the conversation for just the sake of like defining the church, that I don't know if this is me just choosing to muddy the waters, or just I just really want to give everybody more information or expand the conversation. That whenever I think about, well, when I think about this conversation of is church worth it, or people sort of thinking about, what do I do? Should I find a local church? Is it okay for me to take time away from attending a local congregation? All these different things, that it reminds me of when I was in my ecclesiology class, which for those who don't know, ecclesiology just means the study of church or the church. It comes out of the word ecclesia. So I'll give you that for free. But when I was in my ecclesiology class, my professor basically presented us, if I remember correctly, this was our like summative, you know, end of the semester. This is the project. And the project that he gave us was that when Twitter was still Twitter, and when Twitter still, I think, limited you to something along the lines of 150 characters or
Yeah.
something like that, it limited you more than what it does now. He basically had to step back into that time and then told us to write and come up with a tweetable definition of the church, or a tweetable answer to the question of what is church. And that assignment has stuck with me since, I think that was back in 2018. So for the last 6 years, that is essentially something that I have pondered and thought over for so long, and I've still not really come up with an answer. Plus, I'm not on Twitter/X/Threads.
Yeah.
So I've also not been in a scenario to have to put it into practice. But the reason that I really like um that assignment that he gave us was he was essentially challenging us to think through the difficulties of when it comes to defining the church. It's really asking the question, what lens are we coming at it from in order to define it? Because there
Yeah.
is the local church that's like distinct, but there's also the global church, the body of believers that are in countries all over the world who are expressing our faith differently, and we're all part of the same body. How do you capture the essence of something that exists locally and globally at the same time? And how do you capture the idea that when in the local expressions, there is the implied understanding that there's some point where all of those body parts, so to speak, are meeting together, often on a Sunday morning in some form of communal expression of worship and hopefully edification and hopefully encouragement and all these things. But then how do you also capture that the local church then Monday through Saturday is functioning out in the community? And what do you do with when you consider that in those local congregations, there might be, hopefully, some people who are present who are not believers, but they are part of the church expression, like they're there. So these are all questions that I've pondered. I
Yeah.
have not actually arrived at a definition, other than I think noting all of those different pieces that do make up the church capital C and the church little c responding to local. I don't know. I think at least naming all of those pieces is worth it. Much less, then there's the question of what, as part of the definition of what is the church, I feel like it also carries the sort of impetus to answer the question of what is the church doing as well.
Yeah.
So
So
I
there's a
really
lot
just
of
say that to throw
questions
it all
though.
out there.
Yeah. A
Yes.
lot of questions there. Don't know if we can answer all of them because that's a corrupt set of
We
information.
can't. That would be a totally different podcast. But I
But
mainly wanted to throw that out there to be like, it's there.
yeah, I think that's one of the things to think about with like the creation of different churches locally is like where are people coming at it from? What is their perspective? Because we know like we have a perspective looking at churches and being like, I want to go here, here, here. Like, what are the different things they kind of bring to the table? That's also like kind of where the conversation starts whenever people are thinking about making a church. Is and we've had the experience too, you and me, Katie, of like going to a church and being like, man, I don't really like all these different things. Like, I just want to start my own place at this point. Or people, starting
But I
house
don't.
churches. Yeah, and people starting house churches out of just pain that's happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's one of the first things to kind of think about is like, how are these pastors or church planners and different things approaching the topic of building and founding a church? Um, and what kind of things are they coming at it with? Because some people, like I said, do kind of come in it from that perspective of like, man, these things really sucked. I really want a place that has this, and that they want to help provide those things to other people. But there's also that expect like different experience that you have to kind of balance it out with of like, okay, these are the things that I've experienced, but this is what the people need. And sometimes those things will align in a sense of like, man, I feel like these people aren't given a voice or given an opportunity. And so you start somewhere with that founding. But it's really important to stay really close in tune with like, what do the people need? Um, because yeah, like we said, kind of the needs for people are different. The stages that people are in are different, and that within our lives we're in a constant journey. And so there's not going to be one like consistent path, but we have different things that we experience. And like you said, there are times when we're like, man, I don't feel like I can go to this place. This isn't where God's called me, but I don't know where that is. And kind of being in this
Mm-hmm.
state of an unknown. And there's some times where you're like, man, I don't feel like I have anything to give to the church. And you feel like, man, I feel like I'm just going to these things and get my free lunch or free dinner. But a lot of times, if you're putting yourself out there or putting yourself into the space, that God will use you. Whether it's saying you just go to something, and you're like, man, this is what's happening. I really need prayer for it. And you feel like, man, I'm just taking the prayers. Like a lot of times, people over there will feel more at home because they hear, man, there's somebody like me. And so being able to like view these different parts of like our journey and stuff from a neutral perspective and not saying, oh man, this is wrong for me to keep on taking things and just going things to hear people. And what if I'm not talking? That these things are okay, and there are different stages that we'll be in within our church search or church attendance. And even like we're kind of talking about today, seeing or thinking about whether church is worth it. And sometimes we'll be in doubt of that. That's completely fine thing to think about. Um, but like you kind of said, like there's these different perspectives, different environments that churches happen in, and the churches have to contextualize. But that's true for us too. We have to be contextualized, and
Mm-hmm.
there are tons of different people that need God everywhere, all over the world. Um, but finding a place where we feel called to, and it's like, okay, well, why does God why does God call us to church? I think it's like a question I'll kind of pose to you too.
Hmm. Well, that sort of pings to me the like, why does God call us to church? And first of all, I feel like I should name that I've noticed that I think a lot of evangelical churches and mega churches, and often those are the same thing, but not always. I feel like they love going back to Acts as the example, but it feels like they often cannibalize different parts of Acts to like pull certain scenes and tableaus that are described of the believers in Acts who were gathering. And they completely take those scriptures devoid of the context and fact that the believers and early church post Jesus ascending and rising back to heaven. I think it's important to remember that those members were gathering partially out of necessity and partially out of, a shared desire to survive being truly actually persecuted. Like actually being hunted down because of what they were saying and how that was interacting with empire. So one, I just again wanted to like bring context back into I think the question of acts. And I'll just stop it there for now. But there's also the question of like, okay, first of all, is God calling us to a local church? Or is it that God has designed his believers and all of his image bearers to be communal? And as part of that, in the design for his believers to be communal, that when you're stepping into the faith of, claiming and naming Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and understanding that there is relationship there that's now being opened up, and access to power, of who God is,
Hmm.
and true entry into the kingdom, and family of God, right? So like all these different things. That the first question I think is like, what is it that believers are stepping into, period, to begin with, and that it's the broad community of God, and there's some of that community, actually all of that community is wild and out in some way or another. It just looks different.
Hmm.
um and again, that's a whole other conversation that I'm going to leave for a second. But one, there's a stepping into a community, and two, when it comes to the question of, is God calling us to the church, or is it that he's calling us into and creates and invites us into a community? And then by the nature of, we are embodied beings with physical locations that we are at any given time and a body, then it makes sense that the next step, or that some piece of that communal element of our faith, would draw us together in one way or the other. And
Hmm.
then it gets into the conversation of like, hopefully that church, whatever local church you're going to, whether it's a house church, it's an unofficial church that's like a Bible study, but you're meeting consistently, but have had conversations about it, or it's a huge, giant church, anything in between. Hopefully, that church, one, values the dignity and diversity that is of the body. So I tend to be highly skeptical of homogenous communities.
Hmm.
Um, Homogenous, whether that be cultural background, heritage, racial, like all the things. Hopefully, that church is open to some form of hearing from different voices and different people with different backgrounds. And it really just draws me back to, really, the call of the individual believer is the call of the community of believers, which is to do justice, to love mercy, and while you're at it, walk humbly with your God, hopefully in community. And I could pull a lot of scriptures. I'm not going to, but I could say with confidence that across the narrative of scripture, that there is a communal element. That's a combo out of like, both out of necessity, and I think of divine purpose, that the Lord almost repurposes, right? Because
Hmm.
we can be communal about like anything. But the idea of being communal around the concept of loving God, and around the person of Jesus Christ, and around the concept and action of loving your neighbor through doing justice, going to the margins, and never just sitting and being comfortable. I think all of those pieces are like, in my head, what I think is most important, of like, we're stepping through that lens first, right? And then it's like, after you step into that lens, to me, theoretically, I've been using the language of outpost a lot recently, and working with like the Christian small businesses that I work with, where I'm telling them that they are outposts of sorts, like outposts of the kingdom out in the community, obviously Monday to Saturday, in some ways Monday through Sunday, every day, in different contexts that are not primarily churchy.
Yeah, I
And
have
I
something
would
to
say
say on
that
that too.
that's the church. Okay,
Uh-huh.
go for it.
So I think
I'm
the
spiraling.
the interesting thing with that, or like calling people outposts, is um, like we have this big idea in like business stuff, just in general, that like networking is one of the best things you can do, because you get connected to all these sorts of people, and those people give you connections out here, and like that's gonna bring you business, it's gonna bring you clients, or like you're gonna be able to have a better idea of what's going on. And so that idea of diversity is like it's a necessity, because if we just stay in our one little place, like even if it's just business, you're like, I'm gonna stick to this one little neighborhood, you're limiting yourself and limiting the capabilities of, whatever you're a part of, whether it's a business or whether it's just yourself, or whatever it might be. And so if networking is so important to us in business, why is it not important to us in the church?
Oh
Because
my.
that's the cool thing, is like the church, like whether we're looking locally and then stepping up to internationally, it's a much larger picture of a large group of believers that share something in common. And so if we share that thing in common, let us care for one another. But also, if people aren't in that community or we're not naturally connected to them, let us strive to go out and find those people and to be a part of those people's lives. And like I think one of the most important things that I've been learning within sales, so I do like handyman type of job, doing sales for that. But one of the most important things is asking people how you can care for them. And so I think that exact same logic applies to uh, the church. Like the church isn't a business, but we are a
Mm-mm,
group of
it
people
is
that are
not.
we are a group of people that are seeking to help one another and to use our giftings, use our talents and everything to be a part of that network and to flourish. Like, you know, I've always heard this in business too. Like if you do better, we do better. And so in the church, if you're doing better, we're doing better. If we're helping others to do better, we're gonna be doing better.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so use it as like a way to like, like I said, sometimes there are times whenever you have nothing to give. That's the beauty of it, is it's something that can also give to you. And you don't
Hmm.
have to necessarily ask, but making those needs known to people like this who truly like I think that's a big part of it too, is like believing that God is within these people, that these people have the Holy Spirit, and then naturally that means something to us, that changes something in us, which I could talk about more, and it could be a whole different thing. But knowing that
Hmm.
that's part of who these people are, and not expecting the worst, but believing that there can be more, which is like probably going to be a big focus of our podcast, of like believing that there is better. But yeah, those are kind of some of my different thoughts.
Dang, I feel like we've named potentially 3 or 4 new other episodes, like full on other
Yeah.
conversations that we could cover. But I'm trying to figure out how to spin it all together. And I think one main theme that I'm hearing, both in what I ranted and rambled a little bit about and what you just shared as well, is basically it's making me think of when we do our Bible study that we have that is attached to no official organization or local church or any particular pastor. It's just us and friends who we know who all go to different churches or are not going to church at the moment.
Hmm.
Um, that like this you know like ragtag bunch or whatever that we just keep inviting other people, believer, curious, believer who has a church, believer who doesn't have a church, whoever, everybody can come and hang out with us and play some games and like read the Bible together. When I'm thinking about that, you know communal gathering, that is us in some ways, not in some ways, that is us doing church as the verb, right? As the body of believers coming together for the sake of mutual edification, pouring into each other, encouraging. And something that I love about even just that group as an example is that everyone is so different and we all have different perspectives and backgrounds and some crazy family stories that all come together to noticing and pulling out different threads of the text, for example, or even pulling out different threads of like who Jesus is and who God is. So one, there's a benefit in that way. And we're doing church when we hop on a prayer call that is associated with our church. And we're doing church when we lead a Bible study that is associated with our church. And when we go to a Sunday morning expression, that's us doing church. And so is us walking into a room of other humans and simply seeking to listen to them well, love them well, and serve them well, whoever they are in any space. So the thread that I'm thinking about in this conversation of is church worth it and was it ever, I think I'm leaning towards reminding us to expand the definition of church, that it's more than just Sunday morning and it's more than just an organized local body. And at the same time, it can include that. But I think what I'm wondering that I think would be good to spend a little time on is what about the person, and we can speak to this because we've been these people, but what about the person who is currently a believer, has a relationship with God, let's say has community of other believers and not, and that person is not actively seeking to go to a local church? What do we tell that person?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's wrong to not be seeking after a local church. Like we've said,
Totally.
kind of there are different ways that the community that is mentioned in Acts and all these different places like can be found in. And so when we're thinking about, oh man, should I go to church? Like, you have to think about what you're going to it for. Um,
Hmm.
because obviously like, we're not meant to go to church just to, it doesn't say in the Bible, oh, you need to go to church because you need to hear two Hillsong songs and one, vertical worship song, or
Oh
like
my
those
gosh.
aren't the things that we're looking for. That is not what makes things perfect and what makes things edifying. Like the true thing that's really there is the community, and also finding ourselves and finding God in that place. And so there are tons of different ways that you can find that. And yeah, I mean that's like the big thing is having that foundation. Like because there are a bunch of different reasons that you can go to church. Like some people feel so alone and they just
Mm.
want to be somewhere where there are the believers and they want to see, okay, there are people like me. Or one of the reasons that we started the podcast, seeing that, okay, there are people like me who want to see things like be better than they are and to talk about things. And so a lot of times you're going to be going for that sake, and sometimes you won't be finding those people who are like you, and you might say, hey, I don't think this is the place that's fit for me. And that's something that's completely fine. But like, do you have to be looking for a church? That's up to you. Like, is it useful to you? Is it something that you think you can find a place to be at? And is it something that God has called you to? And if the answer to some of those questions is no, and you're like, man, I don't feel like this is what He's called me to. I feel like the church doesn't have anything that I like, neither that I have anything to give a church. Like, you know, you have to think about where you're coming from and who you are first, um, and what you need, what you can give. Like, if you're saying, man, these people really need what I have or like who I am, then awesome. If you say, yeah, these people, they're just a bunch of older people of a different type, and I don't think I can stand having a conversation with them for so long, and maybe they'll have me there at some point, and I'll probably be useful to them. Like I'll bring some new things to their attention, but man, it's gonna
Hmm.
be a rough place.
Hmm.
Maybe that's not where He has you, and maybe you gotta just like stay where you're at until God puts something in front of you. Um, but that's the beauty of it is, like I said, it's not one size fits all. And so there's different ways that we can get involved. Like, sometimes that's what works for us because the church can kind of be like an outpost or a hub that gives us plenty of different things, plenty of different people to interact with. But sometimes that's not what we need. Um, and so I think that's an important thing to think about is why do we think that it's good for us, or do we think that it's something that is actually like something that we're called to, or is it something that we just feel like we should be a part of this certain type of thing?
Hmm.
Like, oh, because you know, I- I'll let you have a moment, but sometimes for me, like I'm even thinking, like, man, I just want to be in the presence of these people, and like, man, I just want to be in a place where I feel like I can feel God's presence. Like, that's not something that I can just naturally experience in the church, and not all people are actually providing a space like that.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think it's important to think about those different things. That's not really an answer to that person or to that question, but it's a good starting
Well,
place, I think.
yeah, I think that's a great starting place. And actually, I started getting like little goosebumps because I think you drawing that question to essentially leaving it up to each individual person to think on their own about why is it that you're feeling drawn to a particular
Mhm.
specific local expression of the capital B body of believers. That's a great question to start with, and again, is its own episode, I think. but just highlighting that question in and of itself, I think is really good and right. And to tease it out a little more, that obviously there is then in the diversity across the body between all individual image bearers who are engaging with this question of is church worth it? Do I need to go to church? What does that look like? Why do I even want to go? Do I think I just need to go because I'm supposed to go? Like all
Yeah.
these different questions that I think even naming that there are different valid reasons to go to church, to go to a particular, again, like local expression, and to lean into the sort of um the only word coming to mind is unorthodox, but I don't even think that's right, but I'll go with it. To lean into the sort of unorthodox expression of church, when I go kayaking, very specifically when I go kayaking on the San Marcos River, but when I go kayaking on pretty much any river, I cannot help but feel like a more tangible connection to the spirit, to who God is, to engaging in his creation in that way,
Hmm.
in some ways, is church to me, because that is me communing with the Lord. And that is not my only expression of doing church, so to speak. I also experience church when I go to coffee shops with one or two people and we all sort of just share what's going on, and in some ways grieve and lament the way the world currently is, and also at the same time those conversations always turn into where is God, what is he doing, and how can we join him in the
Yeah.
invitation, right? So even that's like a microcosm of a great example of, again, like unorthodox church, so to speak, of like believers, we're coming together, we're encouraging
Hmm.
each other, we're also naturally sort of bringing the word embodied and like the literal scriptures into that conversation. And we're pointing each other back to Jesus in our contexts, like in our particular context of family life, of being a teacher, of having siblings across the country and figuring out how to care for them, of being children, caring for adult parents, like all the different contexts that could possibly exist, and just pointing each other to reminding each other where God is and all of that.
Yeah.
And then where does a local expression come into that? And where does the local expression of a particular body of believers hopefully come alongside and enable its members and its attendees, whatever language they use,
Hmm.
to be able to do that well? I mean, man, just thinking about it in that way, what a beautiful depiction of the body at work, I think.
Yeah. No, I think one of the beautiful things, like with a local church and what you can kind of find there sometimes is, having a group of people that are like in the word, that they, even if it's that so much is going on in their life and they're really recovering from so many things, but they're trying to put the time in to read, to learn, and they're taking time out of their week to come to church and to really put in an effort. Like, knowing that those people that are in your community are going after the Lord in the ways that they can, and that they truly seek to see a better world, and that they want to be the best person they can to like help others, to help themselves. Like, knowing that those people love one another and are in it for God is like a really beautiful depiction. Sometimes you don't find that in the church, and
Mm-hmm.
that'll
Mm-hmm.
happen from time to time. But I think that's the beautiful thing that we can find sometimes, is finding that group of people where you're like, man, this is awesome, and it encourages you, edifies you, you learn from them, you teach them. um but sometimes, like I said, you can find that in a bunch of different places. And so sometimes the church is a good starting point, um but it shouldn't be the end point, I think, is
Mm.
the important thing with that too. And so there
Mm-hmm.
are different ways that we should be involved, whether it's, hey, I'm in the church, but I'm starting a Bible study, or, I'm getting involved in this ministry.
Mm.
Um, but there are different ways that you can be connected to things. But the church, like we said, is kind of like an outpost or a hub. And so my encouragement for some of those people that are like, man, I don't feel like I'm anywhere within the church, and I don't feel like I have a
Mm.
home, is, I don't know, even a second ago I was thinking about this idea of like, and there could be one place you're called to and 99 places that you're not called to. And sometimes it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time. And sometimes you might not have that energy for a day. But I would encourage you to like put that time in just to consistently like use a little bit of your energy towards that. And especially for those who are like introverted, depressed, it can be a good starting place because you can find this group of people that are attending this thing, they're joyful. You can see the different people around there who have been redeemed, and they can share stories about the different things that they've been through and help give you hope, and
Hmm.
helping give you, like I said, a sense of like, man, there are people out here who are like me, and seeing that there are better things and seeing people and you're like, man, I want to be like that person. Like those are the simple things that can be a start for you in urging you, okay, like it is possible. And let me see, the ways that they got connected. Let me see the different things that are around me. And the church can help open your eyes to these different opportunities, and the different people that need somebody, or helping you to be yourself so that you can help those people who need
Mm.
somebody. And yeah, I think it's like a beautiful thing is that it all kind of comes together in the church, but the local church is all kind of like a starting point where there's so many possibilities of where you could go. And
Hmm.
sometimes you go to a church and you're like, man, this is an awesome connection. Let me use that. But I'm like, but I don't think this is the right church for me.
Y'all can be my cousins.
Yeah, but it's like
That's what I say a lot.
that's the cool thing is that we're made to work together. Like it isn't, oh man, you need to go to this church because man, their message is so good. Like there's so many different things that comprise the church, and um, there are so many different things that are in it too. So that can be a good starting place of just going and saying, hey, I don't have a whole lot of energy, but I'll put in an hour and a half on Sundays, and I'll put myself there. I'll make myself available, and
Mm.
that could be where a lot of things develop from. So to
Man.
that introverted person, that's kind of an answer for them, but I can't speak to everybody because I'm not
Yeah.
everybody
Right.
yet.
Um, did you just say yet?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Oh, okay, we'll let that one slide. But also something that I love that you said in there is like in referring to the idea of the church being a starting place that I think is so helpful and not an end point. And that a lot of that is hopefully you can find a church where they are helping the community, not just the singular by title lead pastor or senior pastor or apostle or council of elders or whatever the people with official titles, but the entire community of who makes up that church is coming alongside each other to help each other be
Hmm.
more of who you are and be more of who God has created you to be, and to cast
Yeah.
off different. If the church is, I'm almost thinking of it now, ideally, of the church being like a shower almost of like if the different individuals are like the droplets of water. Okay, I'm not making it that weird. But the idea of like the church hopefully being a place where you can come in and be rinsed off
Hmm.
and have like you know different lies that you've taken in of who you think you are, have that washed off, and different burdens, or even if you're coming in with felt needs, that hopefully you can have that served and tended to, and in that analogy, washed off. And I like that idea. I've never thought of it that way, but it sort of leans me in that direction. And it also makes me think of the opposite end of the spectrum, which again, this is another episode that maybe we'll dive into in season 2, that you and I are very aware of and have experienced in very acute manners, when the church, the local expression, an official organization of sorts, when the church goes wrong
Hmm.
almost. And what I'm thinking of is when, in the best description possible, because I don't think, this is just a thought to consider. I don't think most churches that wind up turning into mechanisms and organizations that just sort of churn people in and churn them up and churn them out onto the world again. I don't think mostly the people who start those churches start with the intent
Hmm.
of harming people in mass,
Yeah.
much less in mass and in such a systematic way of like it just happens slowly, 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 and then it sort of grows into that, right? So I think that there is one point of consideration that, for the most part, I don't think that that's where it starts. It's a matter of, though, what does that church leadership need to consider as they not even grow? Because why do we always assume that churches have to grow to be healthy, first of all? But just as that church continues to function and exist in a given community or neighborhood or what have you, what does that church leadership need to consider, and the questions that they need to consider and continue to dive into and have real accountability with themselves, much less within their congregation, to, check themselves before they wreck themselves, so to speak. And I think I'm thinking of these churches that a lot of them are huge churches, but then there are also, as part of my story, small churches can be just as harmful, but potentially because of completely different blind spots, right? And so while we're thinking of the like ideal expression of hopefully what the ideal expression of essentially what does make church worth it, and even considering the expansion of church in that context being more than just a local body that you're part of, but even leaning into communing with other believers and hanging out with other believers throughout the week, of like not throwing everyone out and leaning into that meme of like Christianity would be easy if not for the Christ followers or something like that. like
Yeah.
like not leaning all the way into that, but then also being aware of and naming that there are many institutions who have essentially gotten very lost in the sauce to the point of causing harm, abuse, and even taking in systemic injustice in a plethora of different ways, right? So I just felt like, again, I think I've just been naming things. You've been sharing really great insight, and I'm naming like the water that we swim in, of there's this ideal expression of the church that I think can be found in different ways. And I think it is possible to expect a certain level of that washing, right? Of the washing and support and encouraging and edifying from an actual institution that is a church. And we can't expect humans to be perfect. So if we can't expect humans to be perfect, or ourselves to be perfect for that matter, then we certainly can't expect any given church to be able to engage in that washing and supporting and building up perfectly, which I think sometimes accidentally becomes the conversation. Like when we were looking for churches, for example, and I just started thinking that in true Ecclesiastes style, we would just never find a church that cares about people and cares about doing work,
Got a thought. So,
and where the leadership is actually like faithful and
mhm.
repents. But we found somewhere that we're supposed to be, and by God, it's not perfect.
Yeah.
But it is, I think, helpful to us. And it's entirely possible for other people to look at the same church that we're attending and be like, it's not helpful to us. So we're going to keep looking. Okay, that's my naming. What are your
Okay.
thoughts?
It's a whole lot again. But one of the things that I was thinking about with that is like that I think churches oftentimes, or just believers in general, they find themselves like lacking certain things within the church. And so they try to make something that is all encompassing.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing with church is like, man, if I'm going to it just for the music, I can listen to some worship on the radio. If I'm going to it just for,
Ooh.
a message, I can listen to it on my message, you know? But
Ooh.
we have to know that the church is significant and that helps us define what is actually a church and what is not. And so that's a huge part of it, is that community aspect, because that's something that you can find in different places. But when
Mm-hmm.
you find somewhere that encompasses so many different people, so many ideas, and has a group of people wanting to do something about it and are actually like pushing towards it and doing it together joyfully, that's something that's different. That's not something you can find anywhere. And so that's a big part of, um what's actually like a good reason to go to church. But I think oftentimes pastors or leaders can get caught up in trying to do all the things because they're caught up
Absolutely.
they're caught up in the thinking of, man, like, these people, they're not doing these things in their daily lives. And
Mm.
so they view themselves as having to be all of those things for that person. Because they're like, man, if this person
Oh,
only does stuff on Sunday, I've got to be everything for them. I got to do everything. The music, I got to give them so many songs. I gotta, give them a chance to give. Got to give them a chance for a message, and it has to be a good message. Um, and sometimes they get too lost in like being all things for all people all at once. And
oh,
that's the important thing, is that you can be all things for all people for that person, but you can't
at
be,
that time.
yeah, you can't be everything everywhere all at once. That's not something that you can accomplish. Because if you're trying to do that, you're going to get lost. And I think that's what oftentimes happens in
Mm-hmm.
the church, is they are trying to appeal to everybody and trying to do all the things that somebody, should want to accomplish in their lives, or what God has told us to experience, and like what we've seen in the Bible as a joyful thing to experience. We're trying to give them all of those things all at once because we're scared that they won't get those things in their normal lives. And that's the thing, is like, when we're looking for churches, we should be thinking about those things of like, okay, like, what is this church's desire? Who is this church like made for, in a sense? And
Mm-hmm.
that's the really cool thing, I think, too, is like, within missions and different things, like we think about, oh man, like, where am I called to? Who am I called to? And I think it's important for churches to know that. And when we're going to churches, we've got to think about, man, do these people know who they're actually reaching out to? Like, when they're saying these things, who is their target? And I think that can
Mm-hmm.
give you a little more insight to like, am I their target? Am am I like experiencing some good things here? Um, because yeah, I think a lot of people get lost in trying to be everything for everyone, and that's not something we can do, and that's not something we should
Mm-hmm.
try to do.
Mm-hmm.
We've kind of mentioned it before, and I'm going to mention this a ton of times in the podcast, of like, our value is in who we are. You were mentioning earlier, like, the church helps us be those people, because I think if we're trying to be people that we aren't, we're not going to give a whole lot of value. But if we're
Oof.
trying to be who we are, that's where a lot of our value is going to come from. Um, and so, yeah, you kind of have to question, like, is this church helping me in who I am, and who are they reaching out to? Because it should be a specific people that they feel called to. It shouldn't just be, oh man, I feel like I should have started a church, so I just started one. Like, these things have to be important when we're starting these things, and knowing why, because God is a God of order, right? He is a God of purpose. So everything he's made, everything he's doing is for a purpose. And so
Mm-hmm.
the church that you're going to should be made for a purpose. And if you feel like that isn't a purpose that you're called to, and that they're not a people that you're called to, got to look at that, think about it, like, is this the right place for me? Because oftentimes we're just going somewhere just to go somewhere and just be a
Mm-hmm.
part of something. And sometimes that's good for us, but as we develop, like, we should be thinking about that. And I think it's like cool to go to other places and experience different services, different people,
Mm-hmm.
um, because sometimes we get stuck in that one church, because you're like, okay, this is the universe, this is the everybody church. And so if I have a problem with this church, churches in general have a problem. And that
Mm-hmm.
that is often true. There are problems with the church in general, but it's important to get outside of what our usual is, to think, okay, like, there are problems with the church, but these churches are different. So there is somewhere that I can be, and somewhere where I can call home. Like, so there's going to be a lot of places that are not your home, and are simply a step in the journey. And so don't get lost in that idea of, oh man, I've just got to keep on going. I've just got to keep on going, and getting stuck in this one place. Like, the beauty is there are so many different places, so many possibilities. And sometimes there's too many out there, and you're like, man, there's way too many places to visit.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is that God has made a home for you. And sometimes you just got to find the right door. where that home is, or where it's leading to that home, I guess.
That was really beautiful until the sputtering end. But really, that is really beautiful, and I love that. And you did great. But speaking into the idea of you were speaking more in the idea of like church leaders and official like leaders, pastors, etc. Like not that they shouldn't be everything to everything everywhere all at once to everyone at once at the same time. And I think this might be a good landing place where we can sort of
Hmm.
tie ribbons somewhat on this conversation of is church worth it? That again, the conversation of pastors not taking on the weight that nowhere in scripture, nowhere does Jesus or the Holy Spirit or the Father or any aspect of Yahweh ask any one of his believers to take on the responsibility for being everything to everybody all the time
Hmm.
at once. That's not the call. And there's again, it takes me back to like the start of this conversation. The call is caring for one another intentionally and on purpose, coming from whatever lens of who God has built you to be, which is where hopefully the communities that you're a part of are a part of helping to pour into you and to help you abide deeper with the shepherd, the singular good shepherd, Jesus Christ,
Hmm.
that we have access to, who we have access to because of the Spirit indwelling in us. So, my sort of landing place with all of that is church worth it? And was it ever? Is church worth it in thinking about is it worth it to choose to engage with humans who are believers and are indwelt by the Holy Spirit? Yes and amen. Absolutely. And do I think that every church is worth attending simply because we think that we are supposed to attend a church somewhere? No, because I also think that there is a systemic lack of intentional church building. Not even I don't even want to talk about church planting, but I think there are plenty of churches in this country who haven't really stopped to pause and ask themselves what are they doing and what are they
Hmm.
doing really, and to truly take stock. And again, that's where there have been churches that I would actively warn people away from because they are doing harm, which is actively not what we are put here on earth to do. So, do I think all churches in that way are worth it? No. Do I think it's entirely possible that someone could feasibly be surrounded by only churches that maybe would be potentially harmful to go to? That's possible. And in those cases, I think the question is who has God put around you or who has God put before you to maybe you go and lean into? And I say that as an extrovert with absolutely no issues building community, but also to the introverts. Y'all have power, and we'll talk about that later in this season, actually. But yeah, I think those are my landing thoughts. That as far as the idea of church and is figuring out a way to engage with God's people worth it, yes, with many many caveats and added thoughts and addendums to that. Yes.
Yeah. So I guess just like another point, like right next to that, just to kind of give my own perspective, is like it is more than worth it to put the time in and put the energy in for community.
Bless you.
Excuse me, I was trying to mute it. But I think it is important and valuable to put the time and energy into finding community and being a part of community. The church that you're near, that's like right next to your house, it might not be the community for you. And so it's important to ask those questions like, what am I looking for? What is God doing through me or like to me? And think about like places that can help out with that. But also like, what has God made you for? Who has God sent you to? And that these are important questions to ask. And then looking at specific churches, thinking about, you know, why was this church started? What is their purpose? What has God made them for? Um, and you don't need to get stuck in this one place, this one church,
Mm.
because there are a lot of places that are a fair amount of places that are good places for community and are, kind of actively bad or hurtful places. But the hope that we have is there are people like there who are like us, who, want to think about things and who want to see things improve. And
Mhm.
so even though there's a bunch of churches that might not be doing great things or might not be doing anything really, that there is a body of believers, even if it's not locally, but it's internationally or, worldwide, that there are people who want to see things get better and who want to see God do his work in them and in us. And so, even though it might be hard looking at your local place and you're like, man, I got 3 or 4 churches over here. All of them are pretty messed up. All of them are the same thing. Like, maybe it's time to get out there, you know?
Mm.
If we're willing to put this time and energy sometimes into our business networking, why have we not put into our like social or community working networking? Let's make an effort, um, and make an effort to ask questions because that's how we're gonna find answers.
That's so good. So, with that, I think that's a perfect landing place for this conversation for now, having cut off many, many rabbit trails that we'll have to revisit sometime. That I think for all of you, our listeners who are coming along with us, who have made it through this conversation with us, that I would say that the invitation here is to just look around and join in the holy prophetic imagination of what church can look like for you, for your community, for the people around you. And as someone who struggles with cynicism and skepticism, particularly when it comes to Christian spaces, um, I have been edified by this conversation. Thank you, Gabe, for sharing and sort of reminding me, so to the fellow skeptics and maybe cynics out there, um, that it's not hopeless. It's not easy, um, but it's not hopeless. And we don't have to leave it this way. So, yeah, with that being said, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Beauty in Between. And we will talk to you all next time. Bye.
See y'all later.